Recognized Uncle Walker D01. Recognized Angela Murray D30.
Hello, team. Today in the Watchtower, we welcome Angela Murray. Angela is an award-winning author for the multi-gold Annie Award-winning website Gnome Stew. She's also a host of the Gnomecast, Gnome Stew's own podcast, and was a founding member of Rogue Princess Squadron, a female-centric gaming blog. Angela's writing focuses on cooperative storytelling, player involvement, and working to bring both the entertainer and the entertained closer together. She's also a fantastic game master, and if you get an opportunity to play at her table at a convention, please do not pass that up. Angela, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our discussion episodes draw on anything and everything related to Young Justice, including both seasons of the series so far, the comics, and the video game. If you've not seen, read, or played all the material and are spoiler-wary, please consider this your warning.
Hopefully if they're here.
We actually have some people who listen to us while they're watching the show and skip the spoilers section. They've never seen it before, so I like to make sure people know.
Yeah, it's polite.
It's polite. With all that out of the way, let's dive in. So I touched on a couple things in the intro, Angela, but tell us a little bit more about your history, who you are, and what you do in the world.
I have been gaming since high school, sometime in the 80s. I was introduced, with D&D like most people, but found my heart in gaming when I was introduced to Champions in college.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You're a Hero System person. Me too. I started playing Champions back in the early to mid 80s and Fantasy Hero, and yeah, that was my second system pretty much after D&D. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was introduced by a high school friend to D&D, and then he went off and joined the reserves, and I needed gaming. And so I found this gaming club in college, and they were playing Champions. And it just so happened they were also playing basically the GM always referred to it, this is nothing like the X-Men's New Mutants at all. Nothing.
Right,
but it was basically the New Mutants. It was kids living in a boarding school with superpowers.
Right. Because we have all both run and played that game.
I love that game. I love that game.
It's a great theme. There's a reason. Yeah, for sure. Actually, I had the honor of Aaron Alston was a brilliant writer and author of Star Wars games and a ton of Champions material. He also ran a 30-year-long campaign.
Oh my God.
In his world. If you have never picked up or read the original Strike Force, it literally changed everything about how I run and participate in games. He passed away in 2014 at a convention, just completely unexpected. And so they collected all of his material that was unwritten. And Ross Watson and a whole team, Sean Patrick Fannin, I think was involved with it as well. Like a bunch of guys got together and put together a brand new Aaron Alston's Strike Force updated for the modern era thing. And I had the honor of having a blurb in that book. And I just couldn't have been more honored. He was brilliant, and it's such a loss to the community. But if you haven't had a chance to read the original, go read that, and you're going to see all the stuff that we do today, like blue booking and like all the stuff that he does. He had his 10 tips on how to ruin a campaign. Like I was like, I do this. I guess I need to stop doing that. Don't do that. Yeah, great stuff, man. Champions. I loved Hero System.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have time for that level of math in my games nowadays.
I still do math. I still see the little chart they used to use for advantages and limitations, multiplying and dividing fractions. That's how I do math in my head. It's crazy.
I mean, I love the satisfaction of having the character concept and actually being able to get it to mechanically work with all of that math. But it's right? Like, I look at the work that went into that, and I'm like, I have a job. I have a mortgage. I don't have time for that anymore.
And the games that come out now, like Masks, for example, it is like the diametrically opposed game to Champions.
Oh, yeah.
Like, Champions never asks you, how do you feel? Right? and Masks is like, what are your superpowers? Yeah, whatever. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
that's your superpower, right? And Champions is entirely focused on the powers, in really interesting, I think, fun, interesting ways of creativity. But the role-playing has to come from the player, and that's the way it was back in the 70s and 80s when you and I started.
What's funny is that I'm currently running a Masks game for some teenagers.
Yeah.
And the father of several of those teenagers is somebody I used to play Champions with back in college.
That's awesome.
And he took one look at Masks and he's like, "You're only rolling 2d6? Right. That's it."
Right?
That's so sad.
Yeah, right. Because in Champions, if you had a power like, you're rolling 10, you might be rolling 20 dice, 20 d6 in a roll. The minimum roll for skills is 3 dice. So yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
It's confusing when you first get it and you come from the old school like you and I do.
Yeah.
I had to listen to actual plays, of games like that are so narrative driven, which is really what I wanted. Like, I love the narrative aspect of the role playing game. It was just weird to see like mechanics actually playing into the narrative aspect of it. And we're going to dive into this quite a bit, I think, in a little bit here, but this idea of those things coming from the game master and coming from the players versus the mechanics, like good, elegant mechanics kind of guiding you in the direction of a kind of feel that the game wants you to have.
Yeah, the good mechanics, they guide you into what the game is supposed to be without you even realizing they're doing it.
Exactly. And I say this, like, a lot of mask games I see, even some actual plays, start off with the players creating some characters that could be looked at as pretty just silly, like a silly, weird character. But by the end of the first mask game, the way that the game mechanics work, you are deep in drama with those characters in a way that just pulls you in. If you made these same characters in Champions, then they would just be doing whatever. The mechanics guide you into more combat and skills challenges and things like that, but it's just this difference between the systems, and I love them both, right? They both do amazing things for what they do. Yeah, just the brilliance of living in the future now with so many choices, so we were talking about your history with not just gaming. Well, you were talking about like gaming, and you got into Champions and that kind of thing, but then after that, kind of what pulled you into doing game design, and what was your history with, I mean, if you love Champions, you must have been reading comics as well.
Oh, yeah? God. Comics come way before gaming did. Because comics I could find on my own. Comics I didn't need other people to be there with me.
Right, exactly.
I think I was in middle school, and the school was doing a fundraiser where we were selling magazine subscriptions. And in the back of it, there was a handful of comic book subscriptions you could get. Right. And I convinced my parents into, they were going to get my brother a couple of comic book subscriptions because he's a boy. Of course he wants comic books.
Yes,
but I convinced them, no, I want some too. So I think he got the Hulk and Spider-Man, and I got the Defenders and the Avengers.
Interesting.
I like
Defenders.
I like the idea of a team rather than just like, I don't care about the Hulk. I don't care about him. I want to know about this team.
Wait, Hulk was in the Defenders, wasn't he? He was in the original Defenders, but you're saying like him in relation to other people is more interesting to you.
I wasn't interested in his solo stories.
Gotcha.
And I think when I was reading Defenders, it was actually Iceman, Angel, Beast, and a bunch of other random characters.
Yeah, Valkyrie was in it at one point.
Yeah, Moon
Knight was in it at one point, or there was.
It was a woman. It was a bald woman with a green costume. Moon something.
Oh, Moondragon.
Moondragon.
Oh, see, you picked up in Defenders later than I remember. Doctor Strange was part of it. Silver Surfer was part of the original early team. So Moondragon came on a little later from that team. I don't know if I ever read the team when she was in it. She was a cool character.
Yeah, there was also an interesting character. I don't remember what the character's name was. But it was a character that would randomly switch from being male to female. It was like a cherub type, like, angelic type of character. Because I remember the costume was kind of that white Greek thing with the golden hair, but would just randomly, all of a sudden, one day the character was male, then the next day the character was female.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's pretty rare I say this. I have no idea who that is. I have no clue. I'll have to look that up. That's so interesting.
Well, very soon, around that time, I ended up finding that, the local drugstore that I would, bike down to also had comic books. And that's where I discovered the X-Men and the New Mutants. Right. And there I was completely hooked.
Of course.
When I was in high school, I could do the total nerd thing and sit there and recite the history of the X-Men and who was on the roster when.
Yeah. Absolutely. We can get all hipster. Back when nobody knew who the X-Men were. Back in my day.
Oh, and I'm still angry. I am still angry about what they did to the New Mutants after Chris Claremont left the book.
Oh, I see. I don't know if I ever read it after Chris Claremont left the book.
Oh, they decimated the team. They gave it to Louise Simonson with Rob Liefeld doing the artwork.
Sorry, Rob. Not a fan. Sorry, buddy.
She basically decimated the team. She killed off Warlock and Doug. She banished Danny to the Valkyries. Amara and Bobby went back to South America.
Didn't something terrible happen to Cypher too? Something terrible.
Oh yeah, they killed him off.
Yeah, I do remember. I wasn't reading at the time, but I was working at a comic book store. I think at the time this was happening. So I've got it in my dusty files back there, but I don't think I was reading it at the time.
Yeah, and then she brought in all of her teenage characters from X Factor, which was just it was like you ruined this book.
Sorry.
All the characters I care about are now gone.
All right, we do this once in a while because it's kind of it's really hard to talk about Young Justice and teen superheroes without X-Men coming up, and I love the X-Men. So it's super easy to skip over. But yeah, so that makes sense. So you had, it sounds like you were heavy on Marvel though. It sounds like Defenders, Avengers, X-Men.
I was very heavy on Marvel. I did foray into collecting some DC. I collected The Outsiders.
You picked the back of the shelf teams, man.
Yeah.
Defenders, Batman and the Outsiders, they're great comics, but not ones usually people pick up.
Justice League. I was totally into Justice League Europe.
That's so funny, because who was telling me? Oh, Jeff Stormer was saying one of his first books he ever picked up was Justice League International when it was led by Aquaman with Booster Gold, a totally bizarre team, and he loved it.
I loved the buddy comedy set up between Booster Gold and Blue Beetle, the disaster that was Guy Gardner trying to date Ice.
Was it Ice or Fire? I can't remember.
I think he was trying to date Ice, and Fire was just what are you doing?
The disaster that is Guy Gardner is the best statement. Oh God! Every character in there was a train wreck, except for the girls. Ice and Fire were great, and then you had the Blue Beetle. See, this is the thing that bums me out. I love Ted Kord. I think he's great, and him being the straight man to Booster was just this wonderful dynamic that was so great. And we haven't gotten Booster in Young Justice, which would be interesting to see, because I have a feeling as this next season comes up, then we may get a little time jumping and we may get some other stuff. I'd like to see if Booster shows up. But if Booster shows up and Ted's dead,
yeah,
I want to see those dynamics, right?
Yeah, because I love Jaime, but he doesn't have that same straight man quality that Ted did.
No. And you know what? Let's carry this over into what we were going to talk about, because I think this really easily segues into what we were going to talk about on the show today, which is this idea of balancing humor and drama, right? So you and I met online after I heard you on Gnomecast talking with our mutual friend Chris Sneezak about narrative tips in gaming. And listening to you talk about how you weave storylines at a table and how you work with the players to create this kind of this cooperative narrative and thing that wasn't just a game master behind the screen telling you what's happening and the players reacting to what's happening, a truly cooperative narrative. It made me want to play at your table. And so I think I very gently browbeat you. Exactly. Browbeat you, strong-armed you into running a game for me of Masks at Gen Con that year, And it was fantastic. We had such a great time. So this is the reason why I wanted to get you on the mic with me to talk about these narrative tools. But when we were talking about what specifically we might want to discuss, you had brought up how Young Justice manages to balance this humor and drama. And I think this concept of why this Booster Gold Blue Beetle dynamic is so appealing to people is because it incorporates this idea in DC that this idea that being a hero doesn't have to be angst-ridden and dark, right? Yeah. The 90s and the late 80s and 90s with the X-Men, it was fantastic, but everybody was angst-ridden and everything was dark and everybody had parents who hated them and, or somebody died. You had Punisher came to fruition, that kind of stuff. And it was just, Marvel was just a very different kind of company. And DC was still trying to drive like our heroes generally, our heroes don't kill. It's just a thing that happens, that doesn't happen in our comics, right? We have this balance of this humor and lightheartedness, like Justice League International and Justice League Europe and Guy Gardner and Blue Beetle and Booster Gold and balancing it with the more serious character. Like, why? I'm sorry. I just had the flashback of that moment in Justice League International where Batman just punches Guy Gardner in the face and just knocks him unconscious because he was up in Batman's face about something being an idiot. And Batman, I've never ever seen him do anything like that, just lays Guy Gardner, a Green Lantern, out on the floor. Oh, so
Guy
funny.
Gardner has that ability to bring that out. Just
everybody wants to punch him. Oh, and that's why that one line in the first season of Young Justice, where they're trying to decide who's going to be brought onto the team, and Flash is like, well, there is another Green Lantern, and John and Hal are both no. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm like crying. I'm laughing so much. It's so funny.
During that scene, I mean, that scene is brilliant for so many other things.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But that particular moment, if you knew who they were talking about, was like, oh my God.
And we never get to see him. Like, Guy shows up in the Justice League CGI animated show, and it was handled really well. I thought it was pretty great. He shows up in Batman Brave and the Bold. Like, you get to see the goofiness and that kind of stuff. But in the comic, like, he's goofy and he's weird and he's got this funny attitude. And in the comics, he's kind of a raging jerk. So, like, they handle it a little differently in the younger animated shows. But we've seen him in Young Justice. We know he exists. We've seen him actually doing things, and he gets mentioned, but we never get to see how like hilariously counterpoint he is to like the straight-laced Hal or like the incredibly like intellectually creative John who used to be a Marine, and then you get Guy Gardner.
Just how the hell did he even get a ring?
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so funny. So anyway, so we wanted to talk about this, what we're talking about, this balance of humor and drama. So why was that particular aspect of Young Justice something that jumped out at you? Did you feel like it was something different than you'd seen in other shows, or is it something that you just particularly like when a show is able to do this kind of a thing?
I think it was something different. In a show aimed at kids, it was something a little different. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this particular subject is I think around the time we started playing with the idea of me, coming on as a guest and talking about stuff, I had recently run a game of Masks at a convention, and I had to stop the game about an hour in. And the way I described this is as I told the player this, I'm like, when I run this game, I'm running Young Justice. You're playing Teen Titans Go.
Oh.
So it was definitely his humor was going on that off the rails slapstick.
Right.
My problem with that level of humor is it's divorced from the competency and legitimacy of the emotions of the characters. And one of the reasons why I love the way they do humor in Young Justice is because they never do it at the expense of the character's competency, and they never do it. Point. They never do it at the expense of the reality of the character's emotions. Even as Connor is sitting there with cookie dough all over his face. It's like it's never meant to belittle his character. You still know that the reality of the things he's dealing with are still there. It's just, okay, you have this moment that brings a little bit of levity to the scene before you get into some of the darker things. It's that, you get a little bit of the light to get the depth of the dark.
Right, exactly. And now not every show, not every game at a table, and not every novel does this. I played in 2 games now on Party of One. One has not aired yet, at least as of this recording. Both of them are pretty dark. Not dark bad, but they're just drama. There's not much humor balancing them out, right? And they're fantastic, wonderful games that I love. And I've played in plenty of one-shots and other games where it was just kind of like fun and lighthearted and not really serious. And those were fun too. But there's something, I think, about this balance, this being able to walk that thin line between humor and drama that allows people to take a breath and relax and be comfortable, and also feel all the feels, right? Just feel everything that they can feel from one side to another. And it's actually hard to do, like in novel writing, like trying to balance these aspects in characters. Like, is the humor and the pain coming from the same character, or are there different characters that are on each end of a seesaw, and are they battling it out, and do they meet in the middle? And like how you navigate these things is hard.
I know for me, it's, if I'm going to play, especially for a campaign, I have to have that balance.
Yeah.
If that balance isn't there, I'm either not going to care about the game because the humor is amped up to a level that doesn't allow me to get invested in the characters. Or if the drama is so omnipresent, it's a burden to play the game, rather than being the release and enjoyment I need it to be to get through the rest of, my work week. Right.
I liked how you said earlier, I hadn't really thought about this, but the humor being taken to the extreme of being dismissive. Mm-hmm. And I think, we do our best to, we don't like to get negative on the show if we can. Like, we try and really look at things constructively if at all possible. And I think that the idea that, like, Teen Titans, the original, and Teen Titans Go particularly, they don't resonate with me because I couldn't figure out why. And I was like, well, it's the humor. But I'm like, why is it the humor, though? Why is it? And I think that's what it feels like to me. There is dismissiveness to the depth and the richness and the history of the character. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be entertaining. Right. I just can't take the ride with the characters. Like the episodes, particularly in the early seasons of Teen Titans, that had Raven dealing with her dad, Trigon, they brought a little bit of drama into the humor, as opposed to a little bit of humor to relieve the drama.
Right.
Right. And I think I'm sit more on I like some humor to relieve the drama as opposed to the other way around. And it's interesting to like sit with my head and like, why is that a thing for me? Like, it's not a thing for everybody. I have good friends who are huge DC Comics fans who absolutely love the original Teen Titans show. And it's fantastic. And I can watch it, but I'm not in it. Mm-hmm.
And it's taste vary. I know people who would, their chosen games would be things like Toon and Paranoia. Which is just like, I don't even go to those for one-shots. Because there's nothing there for me to hold on to. It's all, nothing matters. Everything is all about the humor and the moment and exploding things.
Right. And for those of our listeners, because not all of our listeners are gamers, so Toon we talked about a little bit in our discussion with Chris Newton from Gameable Saturday Morning podcast. He and I talked a little bit about Toon. If you want to find out kind of his input on that, you can listen to that. Paranoia we haven't talked about. In Paranoia, you're actually playing clones, and you are in a facility that's some dystopic future in which it's basically this computer who's running the whole facility. And the paranoia aspect is that the computer, it's basically like Big Brother-y kind of stuff. And when you're trying to do anything to break out of this rigmarole, you pretty much just end up dying and then get rebooted as another clone, and you just keep going. It's basically kind of like a sci-fi Warner Brothers cartoon.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Nothing really matters. It always resets. You're always a new clone coming out to do something stupid, you know.
Right, making bad decisions. I played one shot of Paranoia that I continually talk about that was really funny, but it's not a game that I like. If somebody wanted to run it, like if anybody wants to run any game, I'm going to play in it. Like I'll play in it. That'll be fun. But like really, it's not one that just kind of like, oh, I'm really looking forward to a game of Paranoia right now. That kind of thing.
Yeah, and I know people who love that, who absolutely love that.
Mm-hmm.
I have friends, Windmill Games, who run games at usually Origins and Gen Con, and a lot of their games are that over the top humor. One is they're very anime influenced. One is you're playing grade schoolers at the grade school beyond, at the edge of the dimension, and it's like it's all over the top. It's all very silly, and I love getting to see people love that game, but it's nothing I'm interested in playing.
Right. Well, let's pull it back to Young Justice a little bit then with this kind of idea. So each individual character has their moments of drama and humor, right? There are plenty of times I was laughing like crazy, but sometimes I was laughing at stuff that isn't necessarily meant to be funny. So like this thing we were talking about with Hal and John, the two Green Lanterns that are on the League, talking about Guy Gardner. You don't have to understand who Guy Gardner is to find that interaction humorous or intriguing, right? So you can see them do that and you can be like, oh, that's funny. Why they hate this guy? I wonder who that guy is. If you know Guy Gardner, you're on the floor, right? Like laughing because it was just so out of nowhere. But they're both so straight-faced when they say it, and they say it at the same time. So there are these moments that are meant to be self-reflectively humorous, right? But then you have other characters like Kid Flash. He's actively trying to be funny for any number of reasons. Self-defense, being awkward.
Self-defense, it's his way of providing glue for the rest of the group.
Right, encouraging other people to stay together. Like, he's a good counterpoint to Dick, particularly in the first season, where Dick is pretty serious and straightforward. He has moments of humor, but those moments of humor are pointed, right? Artemis, whose humor, particularly early on in the season, her humor is more degrading, to like other people or like poking at other people. Like that's how she's trying to move things forward, Yeah,
her she's got a little bit more of that sarcasm in her humor.
Right. Or in the second season, there again, these things that are funny, but not meant to be like ha funny. So Blue Beetle uses a sonic weapon on the Appalachian, and Superboy's saying like freshman, never doing the homework. Right? It's funny, but it's not supposed to be like a joke. Do you know what I mean? But to do that, I feel like to pull those things off, the things that are humorous and make people laugh, that are callbacks to something, right? In that case with Superboy, he's calling back to the fact that this is exactly what he was like in the first season, right? And he's now the responsible one of the pair that's going out to do something. It's like a humorous callback, and you pull it in. To do those things, I feel like you need to know your characters, whether like again in novel writing, in comics, whatever your creative endeavor happens to be, in a movie script or in a game at the table. Knowing your character and being able to be self-referential to particularly previous chapters, previous books, previous games is great. Which I think kind of is a challenge with one-shots, which may be why people lean to doing more humorous things in a one-shot with just characters they're going to throw away.
Now, see, this is a core thing about the way I run games. Is for me, it is all about the characters. Whether I'm running something like Masks, where the players are giving me their characters at the table, or if I'm running something where I have set up the characters in advance, that game is all about those characters. Because for me, the best way to draw a player and their character into the story is to have that story be about that character. And it's like you said, the having the reference, and as a GM, if I understand who that character is, I can throw out that little hook or that little reference, comment to the character, oh yeah, you know this guy, this is what happened to you, last semester with this guy. And that helps invest them into the game and makes the story feel more personal.
Yeah. And here's the thing. See, in that Gnomes 2 episode where you're talking to Chris about narrative tips, one of the things that you brought up was this idea, particularly in one-shots, where you're asking questions to the player that implies a history. So you'd be asking something like, okay, so you've sat down at a fresh table with a bunch of people who've never played together. They've just made brand new characters, and you're doing the game. And partway through the game, you ask one of the players, like, oh, so what did happen between you and this other character 2 months ago when you tried to break into that place? Well, that's never come up in the narrative, but you've brought it up as if it is in and of itself self-referential to something that would come up. Like either it happened in a previous comic that you've read, or it didn't, and now we're learning about this dynamic that we didn't know existed before, right? So you're kind of scaffolding storytelling in retrospect, which I think is so interesting. And then if the player grabs that hook and is like, oh yeah, oh that's cool, what did happen? Let's figure that out. Oh man, and then suddenly there is a dramatic thing to call back to.
Right.
Which I think is a fantastic and fascinating technique for any game. You can use it in any game, but in this case I think you were talking about a Masks game. I know
with you also have to be able to gauge the players and how willing the players are going to be, how willing the players will be to dive into that and expand on it.
Right.
I know with my regular group, I've got one player who is, for some reason, very reluctant to give up narrative control of his character. So I can't ask him those leading questions. I have to ask him questions in a slightly different way. Like I asked him I was playing a Monster of the Week game, which is a game where you're playing like X-Files, Buffy the Vampire Slayer type of stories.
Oh, right. Yeah,
and
gotcha.
I asked him what your character was part of this secret organization at one point. What did they do that crossed the line and made you leave them? And his response was, who said I left them? Which is basically like he didn't want to be forced into a particular directional narrative, so I needed to come at it from a different perspective, different direction with him.
And see, for me, that feels like you're not forcing me anywhere. You're actually giving me things. You're not taking something away from me. So it's interesting how you look at that. And then again, drawing it to a narrative creative standpoint for other things. This is why one of the things that is pretty common with new writers who are, say, writing their first novel or whatnot, they'll give the novel to someone, like an editor or someone, and the editor will often say things like, your story starts in chapter 5. It doesn't start in chapter 1. All this backstory and all this stuff that you're giving me up through chapter 5 I don't need any of that. Like, start the story in chapter 5 and then make reference back to the stuff you're talking about as it may come up in the story, so that it can be, it's exploratory for the reader. Like, you're learning about these things as they come up. And this is what you're doing when you're asking that question. You're like adding to a history, right? You're not creating the history first and then making the game fit that history. You're playing the narrative and trying to follow the narrative ups and downs, right? And, this would be a good place for there to be a dramatic moment. What kind of dramatic moment might there have been? And then involving the player in it is very different than other games where the game master is telling you something.
Well, and one of my greatest heartbreaks from so many games over so many years is coming up with this rich, detailed history for a character that I think will help weave them into the game world, and having the GM never touch it.
Yep.
Never touch it.
I've definitely been there.
And it's just like, I hate that. I hate that so much.
Yeah. And God, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not exploratory. What's the word I'm looking for? It's evolutionary. It's this way of exploring the story
It's expanding upon the story.
Yeah, right, and it's as I talk about with a lot of games and actual play podcasts when you're listening to them, they're like first drafts of a story. But it's first drafts of a story you're telling with your friends. Now, if you wrote it down and tried to create a novel out of it, you would tweak, you would change, you would edit, you would say, they didn't quite say that, they did kind of say this, they thought about a joke a few minutes later that would have been funnier, I'd put that in here. That's the craft part of creating like a short story or a novel aspect to it. But because of that, this is where I feel like I fall into this, particularly in games, is this idea of you're going to hand me a hook, I'm going to go with it. Because whenever I go with it, things get way more interesting. Whenever I say no or stop the conversation in some way, this binary kind of it did or it didn't, and I go with it didn't happen, things are never as interesting as if I say yes and know, and move forward with that, which you need to do with characters in a story as well. And I feel like Young Justice does that, right?
Very much so.
Right. We get brought into things like Superboy doesn't have much of a history because he was created right before the show. But Robin is never explored specifically. Like his origin is well known to a lot of people, and you can see it in any number of animated series and all that kind of stuff. But in performance, like Kid Flash says, "Hey, I know what happened at that circus. I mean, this is where you lost your family, right?" Like he knows. Like they don't even say exactly what happened. He just makes a reference to, "I know what happened." If you're in a game and you have a character who's like, "I don't know what my backstory is. I just want to play this protege character to Batman," and you get to that point in the narrative, somebody else can just start rolling with it. Like, "Oh, why are you at this circus?" "I don't know." And he's like, "Oh, maybe it has to do with your parents." And then you get together, you're creating this rich history, and now it exists as canon in the narrative.
Well, it very much goes back to the idea of show, don't tell.
Exactly.
While they never explicitly lay out Robin's background, the episodes we get that brush up against it doesn't diminish the weight of the emotion of those storylines for Robin.
Right. And in fact, it enhances it, but it has to be done well.
Right.
And some shows don't do it well. Like you know that there's something going on with Robin. You may or may not know the history. There's this way to write it where it makes you curious about the character and that you want to find out what happened. There's a way to do it if it disconnects you from the character, then you're not on that emotional ride. You stop caring about the character. If you see them having emotional reactions to something and either you never get shown it or you get shown it but it doesn't seem congruent with the emotions that are being felt.
Right.
You know, maybe you're more curious, but otherwise you might not be. Like it's a delicate line to walk, actually.
It is, and it shows a lot of the skill of the writers of Young Justice that they walk that line. I mean, all the characters, you know, Miss Martian, Artemis, Robin, you know, they definitely walk that line of, you know, not explicitly telling you all these things about the characters, but then showing you as things, you know, progress through the story. And it's like with the role-playing game, you don't need that full detailed character background when you first sit down to the table. A lot of that stuff can come out as you know, the game progresses and you realize, hey, this means a lot to my character. And you can pull that in, or the GM can throw you that hook, like you said, that you latch onto and spin into something even bigger. Yeah.
And there's a way to do it in, like, again, the 20-page background for a character, right? For a game that you do, or the 20-page write-up you do on the history of a character in a novel, right? Mm-hmm. You write up that character. It's good to know that character if you're going into the novel, but you don't need to take those 20 pages and put them in and seed them in the first couple of chapters. Like, just show us in the middle of the action. Like, show the character doing those things, right? Have other characters bring up questions about their history or why they reacted in a particular way so that we can, again, scaffold the learning. If you do this information dump, right? This just talking heads information dump at the beginning, we're not emotionally connected to that. It's only giving information.
Mm-hmm.
So I talk about how the way that I look at storytelling, good scenes will, or scenes that I think, instead of saying good, scenes that connect with watchers or readers tend to be scenes that do more than one thing. So a scene can give information, it can develop character, and it can move the plot forward. If you're only giving information, you're just being talked at like a lecture, somebody behind a podium, you're going to fall asleep, right? But if that information is also building character and moving the plot forward all at the same time, you just feel like everything is just moving forward with a pace, as opposed to stopping for a quick lecture in the middle of the action and then going on.
Yeah, very much so.
And the way to do that in games, because part of the game master's job, I think one of the most important aspects of a game master's job is making sure that, one, the spotlight is going onto every character and every player so everyone feels like they're involved.
Absolutely.
And also helping to move the story forward, whatever it happens to be. And if moving it forward means talking about a flashback, or creating part of the background and involving all the players in discussing that background, then everyone becomes more invested.
You only need to put in enough of that background at the beginning of the game for the players to get that initial launch into the story. Mm-hmm. Don't give them an info dump. Don't, it's very tempting for GMs to go into a 30-minute lecture about the nature of the game world, and all you're doing is putting your players to sleep.
Actually, that's a really good point too. From a narrative standpoint, the spending the first 5 chapters of your novel telling everyone about the detailed history of the world that they're going to explore in a few minutes, it doesn't work for you. Like Star Wars worked because it was in media res, right? It just dropped you in the story. You don't know what the situation is. There's an empire. There's a thing. What's happening? This is wow. Whoa! There's so much action. What's happening?
One of the modern examples that I find to be absolutely perfect in its execution of this is Mad Max Fury Road.
Oh, interesting. Why don't you dive into that a little bit? Because
that one is you may come into the movie knowing that Mad Max is this character. There's this post-apocalyptic wasteland, but the movie itself never takes the time to explain things to you. It just gets into the story and shows you as it goes.
Right.
Everything about that world, there's never anyone who sits down and goes, well, this is the reason this society works this way. You're simply just shown, like the War Boys.
Yep.
The War Boys are, you realize they're young, they're sickly, they're all, living around this almost religious car culture. And they definitely have, as they progress, you get the witness me and the Valhalla thing that they're all about. And it's like, more about them and care more about what that culture means for them than if somebody had sat down and there was this exposition, narrative over the top of the opening of the movie to explain, who these people were. It's like, no, right. Just show us.
Right. And that's an example that doesn't work is the live action Avatar: The Last Airbender movie.
Oh God, I was thinking about that. I
try not to think about it at all. But the thing that happens at the beginning of that movie is there's a voiceover. Katara does a voiceover during the very beginning that explains the history of the world, and it's kind of reflective of the show, which is cute. Not 5 minutes later in the movie, she and Sokka sit down to talk to Gran and ask her, please tell us the history of our world that we should already know. And also the people sitting in the audience literally just heard me tell them. So let's do it again. I like, okay, so wait, what? Like none of this is moving character. None of this is doing anything. If it's a voiceover like, Galadriel at the beginning of Lord of the Rings, where this poetic introduction. Okay, that's kind of cool, but don't also then tell me other stuff. Like you tell me a little bit of the history that's important, and then that's it. Like, that's all I need. And then layer everything else on top of it. That's fine. It's a little seed.
Yeah.
But do not tell me the entire history of Middle Earth.
Oh, and the live action Last Airbender just it just breaks so many of those rules of show, don't tell, and it wastes so many opportunities.
Yeah.
You know, of the way it can show things. There's the scene where they come upon the Airbender, the remains of the Airbender
temple.
Village. It's just the cinematography is wasteful in not showing you things like, you know, as they come around these bends, it should have been, you know, this revelation to see the remains of the city. And instead, you know, you see the city and then it's blocked by a cliff as they come back around it. And it's like, it serves no purpose.
Right. And that's interesting too, again, from a narrative standpoint. So there you have the visual, and from a writing standpoint, or from a presentation like in Young Justice standpoint, again, every scene or every moment should try to do a couple of things at a time, like be efficient to help move things forward. But also, particularly in writing, invoking different senses, right? In what you're writing about, like describing the world around someone. You can layer that to be presented in an exciting and interesting and you know, fascinating way to the reader, instead of just, you know, dumping that, right?
Yeah.
So again, not just people talking to each other, but also in how you end up presenting the world around you. Like, we get dumped in the Young Justice world, the DC Comics Young Justice world. And when I first started watching it, I was like, oh, we're going to focus on the sidekicks. It's going to be a sidekick show. We might see some of the other heroes, but we won't see anybody really. Big deal. Young Justice is not about the sidekicks. Young Justice is basically Justice League everyone. It's just the DC animated universe across the galaxy. It's everything. And the genius of that is, it's, again, diametrically opposed from Teen Titans, which was, there's these preteen kids by themselves in a tower, and they don't have any parents. They don't have a home life. They have this tower. Where'd the tower come from? Did somebody build it? It was the Cyborg's dad. Like, where did any of this history come from? We don't know. That's making me feel disconnected from the characters. And doesn't, I don't know, it might get revealed in later seasons that I don't remember. But in Young Justice, as we're watching this, the characters do not exist in a vacuum. Who they are and who they become and who they want to be is also in reflection of not just each other, but the adults, the other heroes, the legacies they have to fill, and everything else. And we get introduced to that as the show goes on.
The key is also that the world is a larger place than just what you're seeing on the screen with the characters.
Right.
They have lives beyond the cave. They have home lives. They have people in their backgrounds, their histories that are still there, that are still impactful. Whereas something like Teen Titans, it's almost, what's the term, tabula rasa, where there's nothing else. There's just what you're seeing on the screen.
Right.
And I think going back to the weaving in the humor and balancing that with the drama is that's part of it for me, is making sure the world is a living, breathing place beyond just what you're seeing on the screen in front of the characters. Right, exactly. And I think this is one of the reasons why I'm sure it is one of the reasons, like, so many, we ran a poll, Twitter. 50% of the people that answered the poll said that they have never read a comic in their life and were fans of Young Justice. Another 25%, so this would be 75% total of the people who answered, 25% said they had never watched a live-action TV show and were not interested in superheroes before they watched Young Justice. Only 25% of the people that we polled out of 100 plus, 150 people that answered, only 25% of those people said that they knew these characters, read comics, and were active superhero fans. 75% of people. My co-host Emily, my season 2 co-host Emily, the show got her into a comic book store. Yeah. That she had never had an interest really in going into before, because of the fact that the world, like you're saying, the world is rich and real and interesting. The characters have layers and have this balance of comedy and drama. And what do you think about the idea that this balance of comedy and drama is almost just the idea that it's reflective of real life in some way?
Like, we all have these terrible dramatic moments, but we also have these really fun, lighthearted moments, and that's what makes things feel real to us.
And I think that really is a key to it, because if you can, in your real life, if you can step back and just shake your head or chuckle at the absurdity of real life happening to you, that gives you the kind of the balance to be able to deal with all of the minutia that you have to deal with in your daily life. I think, not to, because I am definitely a little more familiar with Marvel than I am DC, but I think this is also one of the reasons why the Marvel Cinematic Universe succeeds, because they do that as well. They don't necessarily, they have the Easter eggs in there for the people who know the comics and know the stories of these characters before they made it to the big screen, but they don't rely on that for people to be able to get invested in these characters.
Right.
And this is where Young Justice succeeded. It's like they present you the characters. This world is already rich and deep and has so much going on to it, but you are given these, real emotional connection points that you can establish with these characters, whether it's through the humor or through the pathos of who these characters are and what they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And the first episode where we find out, we get this nice mix of, like, we know Robin and Kid Flash have worked together for maybe years in the past, right? But Aqualad, maybe they know him, but not so much. Like, they know him because he's kind of a work buddy. But even in that first episode, they're like, we've never worked together as a team in the past, so that they haven't all worked together for any reason. But that history, they don't need to tell us the 2 years of every mission that Robin and Kid Flash have ever crossed over to start the show. They don't need to do that. And that allows comedic moments and allows callbacks and allows, again, scaffolding the storytelling in a way that's just fascinating and drops you into what feels like a world that's been alive before we even got there.
Bringing this around to role-playing games again, this is one of the reasons why I am a firm believer in establishing connections between the characters as you're starting the game. Sure, you can have everyone start in a tavern and not know each other.
Yep.
It's a completely viable way to start a game. It's been done many, many, many times over the years. But having the characters establish if that first episode of Young Justice had been a Masks game, the players for Robin and Kid Flash would have said, oh yeah, we've worked together in the past, we've known each other since we were first starting out, so on and so forth. And, Aqualad would have been like, well, I don't know you guys as well, but this is, they would have just quickly established all of those connections so that once the play starts, they, as players, have something to kind of latch onto and run with. And I find that's almost invaluable for a role-playing game.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there are other games too. You can do a mix of both as well, as long as you're doing it with intention. So the Turncloaks podcast, which I highly recommend people listen to, with the caveat that it is not a lighthearted podcast. It is dramatically and beautifully darkly heavy in many ways. But what they did was they didn't meet in a tavern, but they did meet in a city that was under siege, basically. So they'd never technically met. Two characters knew each other. The other two characters didn't know anyone of the group, except they found out that there were connections between them that they did not know that had to do with the plot. And some of them were very direct connections. I don't want to spoil anything, but some of them were just connections about the fact that they'd all run into aspects of the plot in the past that they did not realize the other person knew or had also run into, a part of the plot. And the reveals actually were not just for us, the listener, they were clearly for the players who were like, wait, what? Like, you could just, and it's always like this deep emotional punch. So you can do both as long as you're not writing that, Deus Ex Machina feeling forced connection. Right? As long as you're really focusing as a writer on making sure that it all makes sense, and as a game master, making sure that it all doesn't seem like too hard to believe.
And the players, the players have to buy into it.
Exactly.
The players have to find those motivations.
Great point.
For themselves as well.
Mm-hmm. They have to want to participate. Oh, again, back to that narrative conversation you were having with Chris. You were talking about that buy-in, basically. And it's like what you were saying earlier. So this idea that you are offering something or someone's offering something and then someone is receiving it. Right? They have to say like, oh, instead of saying like, my character wouldn't do that, which is a cliche trope in role-playing games, which shuts everything down in the action, instead of thinking, why would my character do this? My character wouldn't normally do this. I wonder if I can think of an interesting reason as to what would make me want to do this, and where does this take me, and how do I grow as a character, and that leads you on a much more interesting path. But to do that, for me, in my opinion, but that also requires what you're talking about, right? That's exactly this great point you just made. Buy-in, right? Buy-in from the player.
You can be willing to like say, okay, I don't see my character doing that exactly, but let's negotiate this and find something that is a balance that would work for these two characters.
I had a player in a game that was starting to frustrate other players. And so I talked to him and I said, so you keep saying no and you keep fighting against everything anybody else wants to do. You keep fighting against anybody changing your mind. What is it they have to do to change your mind? And he's like, I don't know, but they haven't done it yet. And I'm like, okay,
God.
that can't happen. Like, you can't just keep saying no to every idea that they have. You have to be a part of the process. If you don't understand what would change your character, then you need to figure out either why this character is in this storyline or create a different character. Because you have to be there.
The very first article I ever wrote about gaming and published online was called The Reluctant Hero. And it talked about that player who basically makes the quintessential reluctant character, but then doesn't understand that no, Bilbo doesn't want to go on this adventure, but eventually he decides to anyway. No, Peter Parker doesn't want to be a superhero, but eventually he decides to anyway.
Right.
No, Sam Winchester doesn't want to go fight monsters with his brother, but he decides to anyway.
Right.
You know, you have to be willing to, yes, you can start with that core reluctance of not wanting to do these things, but if you're going to be part of the game, you have to find a way for your character to decide to go, yes, I'm going forward with this.
Right. So there's this social contract. We talk about the social contract of sitting down to a table to play a game together. The social contract is you're sitting down to play together, right? As a group and be together as a group. And from a narrative standpoint, looking at it from a narrative standpoint, you do not put a character into a novel or short story that either isn't doing something or what they're doing and their point in the story is exactly the same as a different character. Like you have to pick one or merge them together or do something with that. And you do not put a protagonist in the story that fights the story. Like, why am I watching this? The social contract of me picking up a novel or watching a movie or whatever it happens to be is that you are telling me something is going to happen in this movie that I should be watching. That's something that's important enough of some sort that I should be watching, right? Having a character that does nothing or a storyline that does nothing, okay. I mean, yeah, it might be cute or artsy or whatever it happens to be. Some people may like it or they might connect to some aspect to it. But generally, why am I watching this? Like, you know, why is this happening? So those are the questions you have to ask yourself both as a player and as a writer.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Awesome. Is there anything else that you want to add to this conversation that you think we missed?
You know, I don't think so.
There's so much more to talk about, and you have written about so much more of this to talk about as well.
Yeah, it's like I've got a ton of articles on Gnome Stew that touch on different aspects of these, and you know, it's like you get me talking,
podcasts. Yeah, exactly.
It comes out.
Right. So speaking of that, so first of all, thanks so much for coming to the Watchtower and geeking out with me today, Angela. So where can people find your writing and you out on Earth Prime?
You can find most of my writing on gnomestew.com. You know, you can lots of great gaming articles there. You can click on my name and get just my articles. Some of my earlier articles are on rogueprincesssquadron.com. And that one's not active anymore, but there's a lot of my older stuff is there. And I am occasionally the host or the guest on the Gnomecast, which you can find at misdirectedmark.com.
Awesome. And we'll have links to the show notes in the show notes as well to all of those. And I would encourage you, anytime, of course, we have anybody on the show that's a game designer or writer or that kind of thing that writes about these things. Yes, they are applicable to running a game at a table, but they are very applicable to narrative aspects of how to create stories, whatever your creative endeavor happens to be. So please go over and check out check out all the stuff that Angela's done. It's amazing. Thanks to everyone else as well for sharing some time with us. You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files, on Facebook at Crashing the Mode, on Tumblr at theyjfiles.tumblr.com, and on our website, www.crashingthemode.com. And finally, at our email address, whelmedpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoy our show, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can also support the show by giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. The ratings really do help others find the show. If you leave us a review, please let us know, especially if you're outside the U.S. We have to look a little harder to find those. And even though Season 3 has been officially announced and is on its way this year, we are really hoping this year, fourth quarter, we're hearing. Please continue to spread the word to friends and family about the series. #BuyYJComics on Comixology to hopefully get us more stories even sooner and get yourself up to speed for the Season 3 premiere. And as always,
stay whelmed, everyone.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our hosts are Rich Howard and Emily Booza. Our editor and producer is Neil Powell. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.